Yeah, so anyways, let's just kick it off. I feel like this is such a fascinating couple of chapters 1 and 2 on Feuerbach and on the young Marx. A couple of things I want to say here and then open for discussion. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of discussion. There's a lot of interest in this material. And frankly, whenever we read about Feuerbach, I did put the Fiery Brook selection of readings on his work on Christianity, which, by the way, I think we should probably say something about the significance of that for European philosophy at the time, for the background of what Marx and Engels called the German ideology. Um, so it really was David Friedrich Strauss and his Life of Jesus that I think precedes Feuerbach in a sort of materialist understanding of the biography of Christ, right? It's like this modern view. And of course, um, Feuerbach becomes a sort of radical Hegelian predecessor of that Straussian view on Christianity. And I frankly find that Feuerbach's work is a delight to read. I mean, it's very aphoristic. I mean, you can see even in the theses on Feuerbach, they are imitating his style. So it's kind of ironic, given that Althusser says, yeah, there's a huge break in German ideology and in the theses, but in the theses there is a stylistic incorporation of that kind of poetic, spiritual style that Feuerbach brings to bear. The other text that I didn't put in the Discord, but that I would just recommend you read, and it's a very readable text, is Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy by Engels himself, written in 1888, I believe, which is a really interesting text. I want to say a couple of points from that, because one of the things that Engels points out, apropos the limitations of Feuerbach that Marx and he saw, right? Like what actually does this fall down to? Well, it falls down to the notion that the category of the sensuous becomes valorized as that category, which, I mean, putting aside what the core of Feuerbach is for Althusser, which is again anthropology or political anthropology. Engels says very little about that. For Engels, the problem with Feuerbach is that he says Wall Street can preach love, and this will be a condition for some great baptism of humanity. If the Wall Street brokers or something like this, begin to adopt this shift in morality, right? Something revolutionary can come from this. So it's a philosophy which therefore has a certain complete removal from the materiality of the class struggle, which I think is why when we study the 1844 manuscripts, it becomes very clear that Marx is at a pivotal point between this embrace of a sensuousness from Feuerbach and an experimentation with a new radicalization of Hegelian dialectics in his understanding of this, imminent split in civil society, where like the sphere of the worker's existence is this like sphere of pure alienation, right? Feuerbach has no means in his philosophy to think the overcoming of that alienation, right? And Engels says that with Feuerbach, we were seduced because he gives us what he says, quote, a new emotional utopia. And it is this emotional utopia that arises as the solution to all of the contradictions of human existence. Keep in mind also that and I think that in the Fiery Brook introduction, I forget the name of the author that wrote that, a lot of Feuerbach actually has a huge influence on German idealism in the strain of like Heidegger and Nietzsche, in this kind of sort of notion that there is a sort of radical subjectivism, right? This notion of even being in the world and like so there is a sense, and I'm not sure that I fully agree with this. This would actually be a question that Feuerbach sort of is that I would actually want to ask some Heideggerians if there's a valid connection there, but I'll leave that to the conversation. Um, so yes, so those are some general things about Feuerbach. I want to sort of invite others to say things that struck them about Feuerbach. I mean, I think part of this is the notion that it's really, once we get to this section, the second chapter on the young Marx, for Althusser, it's really the German ideology. And the German ideology is so interesting because I think, Engels once said that the Communist Manifesto is actually one of Marx and Engels' most difficult texts. And I think that he's right in the sense that in order to fully understand the type of break that Marx and Engels are advocating in Communist Manifesto, which is a break with almost all existing forms of socialism, right, and communism as they encounter it, one also has to have some type of immersion into the heights of the overly saturated German theory industry, which itself is a conundrum apropos political economy. It's the same conundrum that Lukács pinpoints in The Destruction of Reason, namely the fact, how can you account for the contradiction of the fact that Germany did not fully complete the French Revolution and went through a kind of stultified process of overcoming feudalism, but was also the capital of this profound metaphysical and philosophical blossoming. This is something that Lukács also addresses in his later work as well, in the Ontology of Social Being. And it leads him to actually theorize the political, economic, and material conditions for the production of genius. And he actually has some very interesting reflections about how that same uneven development was responsible for Shakespeare's genius. So you see that's an interesting, almost like optimistic point of a historical materialist, almost dialectical insight regarding the fact that you can have those polar opposites occur. But then the interesting thing is, and this I think is to Althusser's credit, that within the context of this German ideology, well, philosophy gets lost. In fact, all of that ends up becoming objectified into the social processes of the liberal bourgeois order, right? And to his credit, Althusser shows that the young Marx from 1843 up through 1845 was facing censorship and police surveillance and was like engaged in this, like the German ideology was actually revealing itself as to be totally complicit with the liberal status quo, right? So what is all of this highfalutin theory worth in that context? I think becomes a very interesting question. But what Althusser wants to suggest is that it's not, and this I think is a key distinction he introduces in the second chapter. What's at work here is not a sublation or a supersession, but it is a discovery. It is a discovery. And that distinction is important because a lot of the authors that Althusser is responding to in the Marxist journal that which I haven't read. I don't know if anyone else has read these authors. Togliatti is probably the most well-known. The other author that he's responding to, I'm not as much familiar with. Is what they're really saying is, well, yeah, we have to understand the biography of Marx, right? We get this a lot in E.P. Thompson, yeah? And E.P. Thompson's Poverty of Theory, which I was recently reading as well, and which I must confess is a very pugilistic and enjoyable text to read. But one gets the same sense, right? Which is, okay, Althusser, once this discovery happens, once this break happens, once Marx abandons his Feuerbachian ways, once he abandons this left Hegelian milieu, what E.P. Thompson points out is like a sort of a problem, is that all of the sort of class categories of the Marxist tradition that were sort of germinal in the prior Marxist writings, Althusser almost seems to suggest that there's no continuity there. And I'm not sure that I fully agree with Althusser that we have such a stark lack of continuity. That's something that we can dig into in further detail. And I would recommend that people read E.P. Thompson to fully grasp, because I think some of his stuff is funny in the sense because he's giving a critique where he's confessing that I don't fully understand the author that I am critiquing. But to the extent that I think I understand the author I am critiquing, um, here's what I have to say. And I think that's why a lot of Althusserians are saying to E.P. Thompson, basically like, fuck you, buddy. You're already confessing that you don't know what you're talking about. So that's something we can talk about in future sessions. I just want to raise the E.P. Thompson piece. I also want to raise something that I encountered that interests me. A letter to Ruga in 1843 that I want to read out loud, and then we'll open it up to Conrad for his comments, and then we'll open it up to the group. This is Marx writing a letter to Arnold Ruga where he says, the whole principle of socialism is concerned only with one side, namely the reality of the true existence of man. We have also to concern ourselves with the other side, in essence, with man's theoretical existence. We have to make his science and his religion the object of our criticism. Think German ideology, right? Nothing prevents us, therefore, from lining our criticism with the criticism of politics, from taking sides in politics, i.e., from entering into real struggles and identifying ourselves with them. This does not mean that we shall confront the world with new doctrinaire principles and proclaim, here is the truth, on your knees before it! Exclamation point. It rather means that we shall develop for the world new principles from the existing principles of the world. We shall not say, abandon your struggles, they are mere folly. Let us provide you with true campaign slogans. Instead, we shall simply show the world why it is struggling. And consciousness of this is a thing it must acquire, whether it wishes to or not. Okay. So then he continues, this reform of consciousness consists entirely in making the world aware of its own consciousness, in arousing it from its dream of itself, in explaining its own actions to it. Just like Feuerbach's critique of religion, our whole aim can only be to translate religious and political problems into their self-conscious human form. Okay. So I take that passage to be quite compelling, and I find it fascinating also that in the debates about class theory between Vivek Chibber and Mike McCarthy and William Clare Roberts and a lot of contemporary Marxist thinkers, this passage has been evoked. This passage has been evoked in a curious way, almost in a way which I would say is meant to sort of demonstrate, right, that Marxism is something like a kind of problematic that's non-dogmatic, is what I would call it, in the sense that, oftentimes part of the debates, intra-Marxist debates that I see happening on today's left are sort of riven with this epistemological problem, right? About how do we relate to existing struggles, including the struggles of liberalism and all of the struggles of the left, as well as this sort of almost inherited Maoist problem that we have regarding how do we relate to the spontaneity of struggles, which have no representation from parties precisely because parties are in such decline, institutionally speaking. So this passage seems to me interesting and also seems to me not something that Marx necessarily abandons as a form of political practice, but rather recuperates. So I would be actually wondering, right, when he concludes this letter by saying we should do what Feuerbach does, Althusser will derive, well, no, the consequence of the epistemological break is this anti-humanist turn. But if you actually study Marx and Engels as tacticians of the political struggle, strategists, they are willing to use forms of bourgeois humanist sloganeering if it furthers the class struggle. And I furthermore think this notion of truth and ideology, because this passage is interesting because that's another big distinction. Maybe Conrad could address this distinction for us as well. That comes up in the second chapter, which is that the discovery of the German ideology, right, is a break from ideology as such. And so in that sense, it is something, and he even shows, Althusser shows that, yeah, what was going on at this time, right before the German ideology, Marx, as we all know, was studying uh, the events that led up to the French Revolution. This is one of the main reasons that that Rousseau remains such an important interlocutor to Marx. But Althusser says those readings, that study of revolutionary history, was not governed by some left Hegelian approach. No, he says it's a pre-Hegelian approach, the study of history, which was trying to get to the almost like, what does he call it? The pure objects. I can find the exact phrase that he uses. Right? Yeah, Marx's return to the French Revolution was a return to the objects in themselves. It was fundamentally not caught in Hegel's problematic. You know? And what is the problem with Hegel's problematic, of course, is that it remains teleological. So the break also, therefore, is a break with this teleological conception. So lots to consider. Those are my opening thoughts. Happy to turn it over to Conrad, perhaps, if you would like to
Sure, yeah, yeah.
jump in.
Yeah. So what we have here is very hard, I think. And it's very hard because at the most basic level, what we're dealing with, and much of what Althusser deals with in a way that some have described as pedagogical in a way, is a treatise on how to read, in a sense, right? As well as how to think. And I'd like to address that at a certain level of generality, one that may contrast in certain respects with the historical explications, or more historical explications of the last session. So, with respect to the theme of philosophical anthropology, um, I think this can help us elucidate, uh, in a way, the importance of Althusser's method, as well as the relationship to metaphor. And you'll notice in this text at one point, Althusser talks about, and it's not his most famous reference to this, but it is, that would be, I think, in Contradiction and Overdetermination, but it is a reference nonetheless. He talks about the idea, this well-established notion that, Marx had to turn Hegel, this reference to turning Hegel right side up, right? And I think this is kind of, what Althusser will return to on more than one occasion as, in some sense, the archetypal use of metaphor by Marx, right? And what he says, if you look at that, is he says that, the problem with turning something right side up is that the content is not thereby changed, right? You're left with the same thing, right? Um, and I think, you know, this really gets to a larger point that Althusser makes throughout this, which is, in a way, what he's doing is he's criticizing the interiority of method, right? And defending, this unique status of Marxism, right? As something that is not just scientific, but is scientific for a reason, right? And the reason that it's scientific, right, is it's because it's able to exit, right, the dominant ideological field or fields, perhaps in the plural, right, in order to access the domain of history, right? Now, I don't, you know, wish to enter into a debate about whether Marxism obtains the scientificity of chemistry or something like that. And I feel that sometimes these debates have the unfortunate tendency of maybe overlooking or diminishing the sheer diversity of methodologies within the science, right? Within sciences, of course, theoretical physics is very, very different than a physical science, to give you an example, right? But, the problem again with metaphor here, right, is that metaphor is not a scientific explanation, right? When you use a metaphor, you take something else, right? And you in a sense, you in a way that could be construed as a little bit cheap, right? You use it to illustrate, right, the internal process of what you're trying to say without thinking through in a sufficiently thorough way or explicating what you're trying to say, right? That's really the issue, right? Um, and I think again uh with respect to science, I always think that for Althusser, it's interesting because science, I always feel that in an odd way, and I think this would be very clear if we were to look to someone like François Laruelle, right? Non-philosophy and so on. I always think that Laruelle's conception of, or sorry, Althusser's conception of science, there's always something about it that's almost a little bit mystical, I feel, right? And maybe one could attribute this in a certain sense to the way that, um, you know, French historical epistemology in its method deviates from someone like Popper because it's not trying to provide typically, a hard definition of what science is in the same way, precisely because, you know, that is in a way almost impossible, right? Because the methodologies of the science are subject to like a constant multiplication, right? So Althusser is going to be speaking at a certain level of generality. But what's very, very interesting about science, right, is that, and this is what's going to make it different from philosophy in a way for Althusser. What's interesting about science is there's nothing that is, in the kind of didactic sense, there's nothing that's rational about it as such, right? You're confronted by, a world of empirical objects, if you will, right? You produce a kind of alien language, right? That's not governed by the tenets of, syllogistic logic or anything of this type, right? Um, and then out of it, you get this sort of weird, pattern, right, of symbols, right, that somehow elucidates the structure of reality, right? And we see this with mathematics, right, being the kind of archetypal or first science, right, in that way, right? So, I think that again, this speaks a great deal to the way that he conceptualizes Marxism, because one thing you see, and it's very, very strong within philosophical discourses. I mean, there is, I think, a very clear preference, right, for the kind of continuity, right, and sort of holism, right, of Hegelian methodology, right, in contradistinction to, these sort of axiomatic dimensions of historical materialism, right, social formation, relations of production, modes of production, and so on, right? And I think what Althusser is really trying to stress, and what I think is important for our purposes, is that, these things are valuable precisely because they don't afford, right, that kind of holistic standpoint, right? They're not immediately aesthetically satisfying somehow on the same level, right? But neither is science, right? And what this allows us to do, right? He talks about here about the distinction. And again, I don't wish to suggest, and I pointed out in the previous, I realize some people are new here. I talked in the previous discussion about, and Daniel mentioned it as well, about some of the inadequacies of Althusser's representation of Hegel, which I think is very, very important, right, to know. But when he talks about, retreat in comparison with supersession, right? So the supersession would be, the sort of inherent logical consistency, right? Moving from one sort of dialectical node to another, right? Whereas the retreat is the sort of exit from that process, right? In which you actually try to understand the sources, right? Of what is this sort of intellectualized discourse, right? And I think that's very, very important, right? Because that's a return precisely to a kind of scientific field, right? That switches up the problematic, if you will, right? And I found it very, you know, persuasive and interesting as well when he talked about some of the problems associated with comparative reading. And I think, in many ways, this is the dominant means through which we tend to interpret philosophy, right? I think one thing that's interesting about looking at philosophy in this time, in France in the 60s and 70s, is it's a very fissured political field. And in a sense, the status of philosophy, as a sort of, and especially in France, as a kind of, um, bourgeois mode of expression par excellence, is being challenged, right, by these different um, mediums, which are claiming a certain mantle of scientificity, right? So Marxism on one hand, I'm sure it won't be unfamiliar to many people in this group that, psychoanalysis, right, perhaps has a similar status. Um, so, but I think that one thing I liked about what he said was that I think that, you know, from the standpoint of a kind of neoliberalism, right? When Marxism no longer has the status, right? It's something that, it kind of gets absorbed, right? Like into a tidy canonization of philosophical history, right? Like, oh yeah, Hegel, and then Fichte, and then Marx, and then, like it doesn't have this sort of titanic ambition, right? To kind of, reshape intellectual discourses that way. I certainly think today we can see that, the comparative reading has become extremely ubiquitous, and I suspect it was very ubiquitous in his time as well, right? But he talks here about something very interesting, right? He talks about the problem of the comparative reading, right, being in the way that, you would take one thinker, right, or one mode of thought, right, and you would use it as an interpretive means of taking up another, right? But he says here the basic problem with this, right, is that you're making the text subject to what he terms, I think, a secret court of appeal, right? This is unannounced, right? But the interpretation itself, and like this is the thing. What precisely makes it unscientific, right, is that uh, and some people have, by the way, raised the possibility of a certain connection with Korsch, which I think may be the case based on some of the points that Althusser makes, but I'm not sure. But I think one thing that's interesting about this, right, is that uh, because if we really think about, what is scientificity, right? You know, it's really what it boils down to is consistency of method, right? You can't reproduce the results of astrology, right? But if you understand like a mathematical formula, right, it's going to be the same no matter who uses it, right? A million times over, right? It's going to be the same. Right? That's the idea. So there's a kind of, interior lucidity that way. And, part of what he's stressing here is that, um, what would make Marxism scientific, in comparison with this gesture whereby, we simply have an elect, right, a thinker, right? And we're not necessarily going to say it, right? But we're going to read another thinker through this prism, right? Is that Marxism is able precisely to explain itself, right? That Marxism can be returned, right, to its original premises, right? And we can use the method of Marxism to understand, for instance, right, the genesis of Marxist thought, which is precisely what he's doing here, right? And this is why he doesn't want to take the young Marx and use the young Marx to read the late Marx, right? That's not what this is about, right? Because what it's really about is recognizing the objectivity, if you will, right, of the position that was eventually obtained by Marx, and of this science, which is not, Marx may have been the founder of it, right? But it is not reducible to Marx, right? And this is the thing, right? When I talk about us having not advanced beyond this, it's very clear, right? Marx has become one thinker among many. When people talk about economics, right, which for better or for worse, and probably the latter, right? I mean, mainstream economics is regarded as having some scientificity. right? They're not constantly, making citational references to the wealth of nations, right? At most, they usually talk about the invisible hand, right? But in mainstream economic discourses, like, it's treated as something which is self-subsistent, right? Of that. And yet us as Marxists, when we talk, right? Again, the court of appeal, if you will, is Marx as a personality. Right now, I know that of course Althusser in his time and functioning within his political spectrum, he certainly didn't, completely repudiate this. But we have some indication, and I've said this before, we have some indication of, the importance that he allots to the reader, right? When he refers to, the movement of a continuous thought, through the process of history, right? And the difficulties of this. And he says that this is a process without end, right? And it's without end, and it becomes clear in his later work, right? When he says that Marx's work was never, in fact, fully scientized in his life, which makes this even more explicit. But without end in the sense that you, the reader, right, also now have to face the responsibility of the application of this method, right? That is your task now, right?
Right.
I think another thing that's important to note about this as well, and I will say, is that, you know, again, I think so much of this as, a method of reading, as a method of thinking, is about recognizing the importance of discontinuity and recognizing the importance of rupture. And in a way, we could say that, I think that, um, and of course, also, the status of, I mean, science as a kind of discontinuous canon of elements, right? But also, precisely the difference that separates, science and ideology, right? The difference that separates the different periods in Marx's work, right? The difference that separates ideological fields, right? Um, but I think it is interesting. And of course, in some sense, one could say that Althusser's science, if you will, is deeply inspired in a way by the spirit of Lenin to this extent, right? I don't think this is an obscure point, right? In the way that, Lenin has to do away, right, with this sort of, holistic and teleological conception of how class struggle will progress, right? The simplification of contradiction, capital labor, the German Social Democratic Party. And Lenin's scientificity is bound up with the way that he does away with that, right? And he creates this sort of vast and diffuse analysis, right? The various class struggles that are occurring within Russian society, right? Nothing's going to be simple after that, right? We have the women's struggle, we have the colonial struggle, right? We have, Russia as, a country with all different kinds of diverse social classes, right? Not this simplification of capital and labor, right? So in a way, it's inspired by that. But so I think discontinuity is a very, very important theme. But I want to stress here that it's interesting because he also, again, the discontinuity here will be arising, from his interpretation or from his, his attempt to get at the core of Marx's method, right? And I think it's very interesting if we were to look at and compare that with some of the gestures we see within contemporary philosophy, right? Because we can see that in a manner that's partly inspired by Althusser, that negativity and contradiction do have a great authority within contemporary continental thought. I think this could be said to some extent of Badiou's use of set theory, but I think it's perhaps most explicit in the work of Zizek, right? Because of this kind of ontology of the lack, this kind of the supposition of negativity that we're going to find everywhere via Lacan
Mm.
in that way, right? But I want to stress that there's a key difference, and I think in itself, you could draw a parallel with Lacan because it would depend on which period of Lacan we're talking about. But, one thing that, of course, Lacan, he kind of cautions his students. He says, like, un jour vous allez m'ontologiser. Like one day you are going to ontologize me, right? And he's being a little bit, he's a little bit ambivalent about this, right? Like, I don't want to be ontologized because part of the thing about Lacan, right, is he would often argue that, or not argue, but part of the idea here is that the way that he deals with negativity, in spite of its status as a kind of notion throughout philosophical history, is immanent to the method of psychoanalysis itself, right? So one shouldn't divorce that entirely from the method, right, and raise it into a kind of global explanatory principle, right? And I think you can see this difference, right? Because if you look at Althusser and you look at the way that he's using negativity, right, he's using negativity to establish the authority, right? And to explain, the discontinuities and ruptures which are necessary to grasp, again, Marx's historical method, right? He's not raising negativity, again, to the level of some all-encompassing principle that can readily be applied, anywhere and under
Mhm.
any circumstances, right?
But his but his
So
theory but his theory of negativity does not have a sort of Hegelian conception of mediation, especially with um, the social field, because I felt like in this section where he's analyzing Togliatti and these other Marxists, where he's saying, look, most of you theoretical Marxists, when he's writing this in the early 60s are, what he calls analytic teleology. You give an analytic and teleological account of Marx. And he's sort of pushing back against this idea that, uh, well, what you're missing is the sort of moment at which Marx discovers a break from the problematic that was weighing him down. And I felt like, in a certain way, I am sympathetic to some of these critiques that what that sacrifices is a conception of history which is more enmeshed in the social struggles. Like I was quoting the letter from to Ruga, which I feel that, like, yeah, there is. I don't want to use the word pragmatism, but there is something like this social engaged dimension of Marxism that I worry gets replaced by science and by the concept in Althusser,
yeah,
and
And
then
doesn't
becomes
Althusser use that
abstracted.
word too?
Sorry.
Like Althusser uses that word himself, doesn't he, in this section, pragmatism? So I think you're justified
Well,
to do
no, I
it.
mean it's a real question. Like, and this whole idea, like, if you just think about it on page 62, where he just says, and then we'll immediately go to Andrew, where he says, oh no, sorry, I mean Conrad. Look, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
mm,
we can go back to Conrad then Andrew. But I just want to say one quick thing. This problem of you said to me in a chat, Conrad, that one of the benefits of the epistemological break-in of Althusser's science is that he excises chauvinism from Marxism,
mm.
which I find a super interesting point, which I would love for us to all talk about. But at the same time, he may replace it with scholasticism,
Well, I did say, I did say, I
which
did
could be
say, I
its
did say,
own form of chauvinism.
I did say with the potential exception of the pedagogical relationship.
I
That
knew it.
was
Okay, back to
which
you. Back to you.
right, which we will have to debate. But I want to make the only and by the way about this, and I said this at the last discussion. I think that the loss of the relationship to social struggles that you're describing, has to be considered a historical problematic, arising in particular from, the way that Russia was not, for example, particularly proletarianized nation. And moreover, a lot of the people who were proletarians died in the First World War. And they were confronting, in a way, not dissimilar to what Lasordo describes in Class Struggle, they were confronting this diffuse array of social struggles, right? And kind of trying to wield it together into something, right? And I was saying that history and class consciousness itself ends up being a bit of an odd text that way because it avows the significance of the proletarian standpoint, right? While simultaneously aligning itself with the kind of Lenin, or sorry, while simultaneously aligning itself with the ideas of Lenin. But in a way, this is a little bit odd because, there seems to be the specter of the failure of world revolution, right, already embedded within it, right, which is the kind of last gasp of this sort of teleological notion, right? So we see within world systems theories, for example, like they have stopped denominating, like a simple kind of like this, proletarian agency.
Right. But
Okay,
like,
like
but like, but like,
it's much more diffuse analysis.
if you take the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat for a second, um, in a certain way, it's a problematic that is bound up with Blanchism. So one could
Mhm.
just as easily say that latent within the political Marx is the problematic of Blanchism, which itself
Mhm.
is not superseded until 1871 in Paris Commune,
Yeah.
right? So like I have the sense that there's actually multiple problematics. Yeah, okay, philosophically it may be Feuerbach, and that philosophically Marx goes off into some highly distinct thing, and then from there we can debate how Hegel's used. But wouldn't it also be true that like within Marxism there are an array of problematics, and we can sort of identify other fields of other problematics. Not
I,
even
I,
not even mentioning political economy. Go ahead.
absolutely. By the way, and we'll get into that more, but the last thing I want to say, this will be the last thing, is that here he touches on this notion, which I think is very, very important, right? That philosophy has no history, right? Um, and by means of explanation, because this can seem a little bit perplexing when you first encounter it, and I think the book on ISAs, where the famous ISAs essay comes from, the fuller version's been published by Verso, the manuscript, which was not originally published, is the best source for understanding this. Um, but I think that, what he's really getting at there is that when we talked about science, right? Science is capable of a process of refinement precisely because it has a kind of quantitative methodology in this way, right? Now, there may be ruptures, right, that redefine the character of what a science is, right? But it's capable of a progression in that sense, right? So if we look at, the history of evolutionary theory, right, its most contemporary practitioners will obviously, inspired by Darwin, right? They're not like slavishly beholden to everything Darwin said, and obviously, they've expanded and improved on that in a lot of respects, right? Both with respect to data and methodologically. But the thing about philosophy, if we really ask ourselves, I always go when I talk about this, I always like to go back to this quote by Whitehead. He says, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. And I might respond to this by saying this isn't so much because of the grandeur of Plato as such, right? It's because of precisely the ideological status of philosophy. If we look at the history of philosophy in every circumstance, right, whether we're talking about the sort of Islamic Aristotelianism of the Middle Ages, right? Whether we're talking about, Greek philosophy and, the defenses of slavery, which were so common to it, and aristocratic rule, one need look no further than Aristotle's Politics, where he talks about all humans can give and receive commands before going on to summarily justify class rule, right? But, right, it's like on a boat, people have different roles. Some people are better at commanding than others, right? Um, as with, contemporary defenses of liberal democracy, which are so ubiquitous, right? Philosophy has never done anything other, right? I mean, of course, you can find exceptions, but in the main, right, philosophy's never done anything other than, defended the privileges of the dominant class, right? And this is because philosophy, it lacks unlike science, right, it lacks its own interior methodology in the sense that it lacks a definitive point of reference which is beyond it, right, in that way, right? It's in this sense that, philosophy would have no history, right? Without recourse to something beyond it in that way, right, we can go through and we can make all kinds of arguments we want, right? But the premises of history themselves are not disclosed, right, if the fundamental method is ideological in that sense. Right. So I just wanted to offer a little bit of clarification as to what that might mean. Okay, that's what I got.
That's great. Thank you so much, Conrad. Brilliant. Amazing. Um, let's go to Andrew. But I mean, I think on this point of philosophy having no history or having some sort of implicit détente with the ruling class, um, yeah, that's very interesting because in a certain way, in Badiou, who I think is so, as I really study Badiou over the years, deeply influenced by Althusser in many things. Philosophy is kind of like that. that sort of like fifth condition, right? So I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying there. And I want to actually think further about that. Let's go to Andrew.
Yeah, no, that was really good, especially with philosophy has no history. I think he even Althusser talks about that in the Verso translated ISA with how philosophy, since the Greeks, has privileged the aristocracy and the elites. My question goes to Conrad because he brought up a good point about rupture, discontinuity, and science. And I mean, it was very clarifying, but I'm still struggling with this passage in 62, because you mentioned page 62, Daniel. And he talks about getting rid of this analytic teleological reading of Marx. And he says right here, Marx's principle of a theory of ideological development, which is going to be applied to our object, which I'd imagine in this problematic. Well, he lists three problems in this chapter on young Marx. It's the political, the theoretical, and the historical. And the one I'm talking about is on the theoretical. He lists these three principles for the Marxist principle theory of ideological development. And he says, one, every ideology must be regarded as a real whole, unified to its own problematic, so that if you remove one element, it's impossible to pretty much not alter it in the process. And then he says that the ideology is pretty much like related to the field of ideology. So we're analyzing in this third principle the developmental motor force of ideology. And so this truth is not found within ideology, but outside of it. And so these principles that he's listed out are not rooted in ideology itself, but scientific ones. And so that's where I'm like, okay, so then what makes it exactly scientific? Of course, he goes down and lists it because it's able to, I guess, account for the own genesis of Marxist theory. I'm kind of paraphrasing. But to me, that still doesn't clarify anything. So what exactly to the Marxist reading of ideology coincides with scientific principles and scientific truths?
Okay, so I don't think anyone is going to be able to sit here and provide a foolproof justification for the scientificity of Althusser's method. But the way I would put it is this one. But this is the way I'd put it. So the way I would put it is that what we're really talking about, because I was giving the example of mathematics, right? And I was also saying that in French historical epistemology, you don't have a kind of Popperian attempt, so you typically to enclose what science might represent. But I think what we're really dealing here with is axiomatic consistency. So, one thing, and I gave the analogy with psychoanalysis for a reason, because I think, psychoanalysis has a very powerful consistency in its applicability as well. But, the way I might put it is if we look at the methodologies of the social sciences, it might not be a question, I think, more soberly of saying that Marxism is a science, but of saying that Marxism is the closest thing to a scientific methodology that we have for the social sciences, right? And I think, if we want to understand this point about consistency, we can look at any historical text, right? Any work of literature, you can look at Shakespeare, you can look at, anything, and you can subject it to a Marxist analysis, right? You can begin to examine the class relations, you can begin to examine the historical context, you can bring it back to, what is the society and how do they produce their means of existence, right? And usually you can produce something, provided you have a few sources, which is going to be very illuminating in that respect, right? So I think that, and one further thing I want to add is when you talk about the thing about form and content, I think is really, really important here. And I do think it's the case that very often we, perhaps overestimate, the significance of content for intellectual method, absent the question of form. And looking at something like mainstream economics, right? You see these sort of Ricardian principles that continue to get trotted out, right? Like comparative advantage, right? Oh, what you should do is just sell the thing you can the most cheaply, right? And do it en masse, right? You know, and it's funny, right? If you look at the 20th century, right? Which societies have, done the most to alleviate poverty, have done the most to advance on a mass scale. I think Russia, 200 million out of poverty, China, 800 million out of poverty. So this is a pretty compelling argument, right? Against those axioms, but they continue to be applied, right? Somehow we're supposed to believe this, right? Because this is the methodology that's been set up. So of course, Thailand would be an example of a society, right? That has, maybe been more characteristic with respect to market opening up. Okay, comparative advantage, comparative advantage of sex work in Bangkok, for example. We can sell this cheaper than anyone else, right? Economically, if we count inflation, Thailand has regressed over the past 10 years, right? But the dominant discourse, right, because of the form of that discourse, right, and because of the way it's bound up, with questions of political power, it cannot acknowledge that, right? So I think it's very important to understand what Althusser is saying here about the ideological field and the problematic as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think the distinction that he develops on 63 of a truth for versus a truth of is an interesting one in the sense that an ideological truth is sort of caught within a problematic, and so there is therefore this question of an unconscious, like it is a truth of a reflection of this unthought problematic that it's ensnared in. Whereas when Marxism develops its autonomous scientific basis, it becomes a truth for, and it therefore is sort of exterior to that problem. It's no longer caught within that problem. And I think here we have introduced a profound conundrum regarding the application of what that means for Marxism itself. As Isabel Garro shows, the main implication is actually, in a curious way for us, in like a super practical way, it's actually for the status of the intellectual's role in the class struggle. Her diagnosis is that most often what this leads to is a type of subtraction from struggle and a kind of, well, it's negative for her. It's a kind of like making philosophy into some kind of device which can instruct struggle in that problem that I introduced before about how we impose or do not impose our principles onto existing struggles. I really think it goes back to a lot of this for me. Given that our study group is eminently interested in escaping these stereotypes of Althusser, scholasticism, and academic Marxism, you know what I'm saying? I always want us to bring things back to those problems. Can we go to Jack on the iPhone? Sorry to keep you waiting.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
We can.
Okay, you can hear me. So I have a couple questions. I guess my main kind of concern might be articulated as a concern about the relationship between necessity and contingency or something like that. When we talk of Marxism being able to get outside of its problematic, it's able to escape a kind of contingency that's been imposed on it, right? So if Marx is able to escape, break from Feuerbach's problematic, then he is able to make some move that lets him rise above that problematic. So I'm concerned about this movement of rising above, which I guess you might say is a function of transcendence, and how that is related to two things. One, the question of Marxism as a science, and two, the question of a philosophical anthropology. So the question of of the relation to Marxism as a science, and here I'm a total novice, right, in my understanding of Marxism as a science, but I want to understand something that Conrad said at some point, which was that the fact that Marxism can account for itself and its own genesis distinguishes it from other sciences and lends to it a kind of its rigor as a science or something like that. On the other side, and so I want to, I guess, gesture at the way that kind of reasoning has this appeal to this getting outside and rising above, which I think is an appeal to transcendence. Now, transcendence is something that's problematized by Marxism insofar as its transcendence has always been the recourse of religion, right? And of kind of traditional methods of control. yet, and this speaks to, I guess, my question from you last week, yet there's still, in order for there to be a break, you still need a kind of transcendence. In order for there to be a revolution, you still need a kind of transcendence. So this leads me back to Sloterdijk, who says, paraphrasing Socrates, that man is a being potentially superior to himself. This is our anthropological condition. So with that is sort of the provocation I leave with, which is to say that if we accept that, then it seems that Marxism does not get outside of the philosophical anthropology.
Okay, I will just respond to that quickly. So I think maybe the best way to look at that particular question is through the prism of Althusser's post-1967 work. It's important to acknowledge these shifts within it. So, obviously, I think it's hard to have any discussion about, Marxism or its political goals without, acknowledging that, as with any discourse, there are certain things that we take for granted, if you will. And one of those is going to be, as with almost all intellectual life, right, the importance of rationalization, right? So what you're really talking about when you talk about transcendence, right, what you're really talking about, is the attempt to achieve a more rational understanding of reality, right? For which Marxism would account precisely by virtue of its, in a sense, historicization and, really theoretical historicization of the diverse contents of reality. But later, after 1967, one thing that we see a shift where Althusser will say that, you have materialism and idealism, and these things these are sort of first principles, right? That cannot be proven, right? And he has this idea, right, in philosophy that, if you commence with, in philosophy, it's always the most coherent philosophy always arises or always terminates in, a kind of cohesion of the interior standpoint, right? And I think we can see this very well in someone like Husserl, right? Who begins with the idea of getting to the objects themselves, but then, through these various corkscrews, ends up reprising in so many respects Kant's transcendental method, right? Because the consistency of philosophy will always go back to deferring to, interior perception, right? Because it's very messy, right? And precisely, non-logical when you start to get into what's beyond that. But part of his point is that, we have these principles and they cannot be defended like in a way that's, perfectly logical, right? So in a sense, the task of philosophy, right, the task of materialist philosophy, if you will, is to align itself with the materialist first principle, right? With the first principle that is precisely more rationalistic in that sense, and to defend it. So I think within Althusser, we do find at some point a recognition of the fact that, you're not ultimately going to be able to explicate, you're not going to be able to find an absolute point of genesis, right? That all sort of normative claims that could be waived based upon.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I guess this question about where does anthropology go at the moment at which it no longer becomes bound up with the main problematic of revolution. So revolution is definitely thought in a humanist way. By humanist, we mean, so how does humanism change from Marx? We need to look at what the anti-humanist proposal is. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think we're going to examine it more. Of course, the question of humanism still remains, I think, in all of this, but it certainly changes its hue and its direction in interesting ways. I think your invocation of Sloterdijk is interesting to me. I mean, Sloterdijk himself is so far afield from Althusser, and as I mentioned before, his own Nietzschean and Heideggerian connections are interesting. Although he is something like a Nietzschean anti-humanist in his own way. So perhaps there is a sort of paradoxical overlap with Sloterdijk and Althusser in that way that could be gleaned. I will say one thing. I think that Sloterdijk wrote a book on French theory where he has a chapter on Althusser, but it's not translated into English. Ishan.
Yeah, yeah. My question was about Althusser's conception of Marxism itself. If we go back to the principles on page, the three principles on page 62, I read those in a particularly structuralist way. I thought the first one was kind of priming you for that by sort of recapitulating the whole distinction between long parole and why the parole can't be extricated from the long because the parole is the interrelations it occupies, and that sort of continues in the critique of the sort of analytical teleological fallacy where you're sort of seeing some sort of entelechy in the young Marx, and out of which you're sort of saying that he always bore the kernel to become Marx to quote, and you're sort of positioning him in a false that you're doing the first problem of extricating it wrongfully and then sort of wrongfully again posing it in a wrong in a illegitimate context to give it a new meaning that it shouldn't itself bear, and that thereby sort of granting it that teleology. And then he's kind of getting at that volition of Marxist structuralist sort of interrelation between the ideological sphere, the linguistic sphere, with the material spheres. And Marxism then is scientific because it alone can sort of study why in conjunction to the base and superstructure, the ideological sphere sort of exists, and the internal sort of dynamics of it that push it in whichever direction it happens to be going. My question rather was that this conception that he's working with, where Marxism is inherently structuralistic like that, it seems to exclude most, I suppose it excludes most sort of strains in Marxism that have ever been. It excludes worldview Marxism, of course, and Lukács. It sort of excludes, yeah, it's like, I can't help but think Althusser is claiming to be the sole Marxist to have ever been with this, with the exception of Voloshynov, perhaps.
Very funny.
But heaven and earth, I alone am the Marxist one.
Yeah, I mean, this is really funny. And it I feel like in certain way, part of what E.P. Thompson's problem is this idea that in a certain way, like the part we read about Althusser's critique of Marxists looking at the biography of Marx and assigning this kind of like liberal reductive theory that, well, it's all the kind of like internal whims of the thinker, and therefore we need to understand the psychology of the thinker, or even the psychobiography of the thinker, or even the physiology of the thinker, what accounts for their miraculous genius. Althusser is right to, I think, separate that fetishization from from a proper understanding of Marx, and I think there's absolute limits to that, to psychology, to psychologization of thinkers, because it almost is even worse than what Feuerbach was doing in some sense. It's like worse than humanism, because at least with humanism, there is a kind of underthought or undialectical object that is seeking a sort of transformation. Whereas with this, it's all almost like solipsistic. So he's right to do that. But I think that E.P. Thompson is also correct to point out that one of the consequences of that is that this problem about how historicism is then subsequently revolutionized in the wake of that. And Marxism becomes some. It's funny because Aliyah said Althusser and Chris Cutrone with a handshake. I would actually say no, that's not true. And I'm not praising Cutrone, but I would say it's not true for a different reason. Isn't the whole idea of Althusser not, well, what it's proposing is a different way of reading the history, a different way of reading the history of socialism. And it, in some sense, as Ishen is saying, almost gives an imperial role to Marx. in that sense, I feel like Marx should be much more couched within the socialist struggle than Althusser may lead us to suggest. Sorry,
Well,
Matilda.
oh, I
Sorry,
just wanted to,
go ahead.
yeah. But again, like there are weird aporias in how he conceptualizes this. So on one hand, we find in the famous essay on the ISAs, all subjects are subjects of ideology, right? Well, I think that, you know, if we're if we're trying to apply this to history, one obvious question that this raises is how did Marx create his scientific break if all subjects are subjects of ideologies, right? So in a sense, Marx, from that standpoint, would be like the only person to ever, not the only person, maybe Galileo, okay, Euclid, but one of the only people to ever live, right? Through that perspective. But like there's another perspective to this, which is that again, that that the focus on method here, right, is an invitation, right, for anyone, right, any reader, to engage themselves in this way, right? That it's precisely by not deifying Marx himself, but in raising it into a question of method that this is achieved, right? And I think part of the distance from social struggles, in addition to reflecting, the uh, sort of minefield he faced politically with respect to these kinds of expressions within the French Communist Party in his time, as well as perhaps, the relatively late date at which he himself turned to Marxism. I think part of it is because, we know there was a certain kind of openness within his own sphere. Like a lot of his students went on to be Maoists, for example. Well, he resisted that, right? So it wasn't as if, everyone was going to become part of one prefabricated faction. But I think part of the idea here is again that a lot of the existing social struggles were beholden, to people who were maybe, analogous to somebody like Catron in the sense that they purported to have a kind of, understanding of the truth of Marxism, right? This is what Marxism is. World Revolution failed in 1919. Everybody denies it, right? I think in Catron's account, right, we all need to be more imperialist, right? Because, de-linked socialist states or this kind of abortion of history or whatever, right? And this is a kind of esoteric truth, or if you will. And I'm not saying that Althusser is completely devoid of those dimensions, but I think that, in a way he's extending, again, this invitation to, people who participate within these different struggles, to bring themselves, right, to Marx's method and to work within it in that way.
That's helpful, Conrad. Thank you very much. Um, we're playing like the pro antagonist.
Yeah, the good cop, bad cop.
The
Yeah,
good,
yeah,
a little bit of that. That's good. That's good. I don't know who's good or bad. Well, that's for the jury to decide. Um, Matilda, please jump in.
Hey everybody. Um, I think that what's going on here in the for Marx thing is that like he's looking at all these people who are like trying to understand the early Marx, and he's seeing that they fall into this like kind of the eminent, I don't know how you phrase it, like immanentist logic of Hegel, that like the truth of logic, and that like ideological history and like the Hegelian mode of thinking history is ideological. It's very like continuous, like the Hegel's philosophy of, history of philosophy is like kind of like this person, it's kind of this like continuous mode of transition and sublation into the present, and it has a strong quality of continuity to it. And that these attempts to think the continuity of Marx's thought from the young Marx into the mature Marx, he sees all of these errors that people are again falling into, thinking the history of Marx's thinking ideologically. And for like in the German ideology, there's the famous passage that there is no history. More precisely, in a way, it's like there's no independent, like religion, metaphysics, philosophy has no independent history. Like, there is no history of philosophy as an independent ideological sphere with its own history. Like, Hegel is like the paradigmatic thinker of someone who thinks like the sphere of philosophy in its own history, and it's very continuous and very marked by continuity. Marx in the German ideology says that it has no history, no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter, along with their actual world, also their thinking and the products of their thinking. So he's trying to think the history of thought from like reality, and how like in changing the world, humans' thoughts begin to alter. And that thinking about the history of philosophy or the history of thinking in that mode is outside of the Hegelian mode of thinking, and that like prior to 1844, Marx had been had not had this insight, and he's I think Althusser thinks that like in the German ideology that like Marx discovers how to think problematics, and so that was one point I wanted to make. And another one kind of along the same lines is that the Hegelian mode that Marx was in before 1845 is summed up, I think, nicely in this passage, that the whole solution is thus to be found in the critical omnipotence of philosophy, which must become practical by dissipating the aberrations of history in the name of its truth. For a denunciation of the unreasons of real history is merely an exposition of its own reason at work, even in its unreasons. And, that is like kind of like the Hegelian mode of like positing something, finding like it's incorrect and like negating the negation and moving on to the next thing. And what concerns me about the letter to Ruga and this sort of pragmatism, I feel like there's like a sense of pragmatism in it, but perhaps if it's true that Marx is in this Hegelian problematic at that point, it's like it's very easy to see potential reasons in everything. And so like it's almost like you could create like a very pragmatic style of politics by assuming that there's reasons in all of the unreasons. And so
That's
I worry
really helpful.
about reading the letter of Ruga and sensing something pragmatic in it, but it's really the Hegelian problematic that's at work.
I think it's really good because the distinction there is a dialectical distinction that E.P. Thompson brings out in his work as well, between social being and consciousness. And in a certain way, what Marx is saying in the letter to Ruga in 1843 is really that, we have a kind of not an indifference to ideological struggles of like the existing struggles, but philosophically, we do not have the means to impose from on high, from the perch of philosophy, our principles down. We have to somehow fuse something of social being with consciousness. But that is, at that point in Marx's thought, not, he doesn't have the solution for that. And perhaps there is something, and even Althusser, and I can find the page where he makes this reference about social being. I think it's a very useful way to think about that distinction, and also the question about humanism, because humanism also is tied to a theory of consciousness in a certain way. And so, yeah, I think you're raising the right questions. And I think for this study group, part of what I'm thinking is that, all of these things are percolating. And as Conrad mentioned, it's very difficult to sort of get at them. Everyone is sort of a gesture to get at these questions. But Luis can
Oh,
help.
can I just say something quick
Yes.
about in a way that so this problem I feel like is a very classical one in a way, because what we're really dealing with is a kind of anti-substantivalism. So, this continuity that we're discussing with respect to Hegel, really the origin of this in a way is in Aristotle, right? And the idea that a subject would persist across its predicates, right? So there'd be like a subject, right? And you could predicate it, but the interiority of the thing, right? There's like a first term, right? That's inviolable in some way, right? And if you read someone like, I don't know, Peter Sherman, right? On ontological anarchism, he'll talk about, the way that in a sense this is connected with the history of political rule, right? So, the subject has the same relationship to the predicate as like a general to his soldiers or something like that, right? So I think that this is, but this gets in, I think sometimes you can see this problem in our reality, right? And I give you one example, right? It's always this idea of people always say, well, I don't like such and such person for X. It's real love, right? But then the problem is like, what is real love, right? Because what could someone be other than on some level a composite of their predicates, right? So we don't have to talk about, loving someone for their money, right? What if you take away someone's appearance, right? What if you take away their intelligence that's been groomed through processes of cultural capital, right? What if you take away X? And at the end, you're not left with anything. Right. So again, I think this question of continuity is also a question of the relationship of subject and predicates, which is a really
That's
compelling
useful.
historical question. Yeah.
That is very useful. Thank you so much. This is amazing. Luis, please.
So I really like this example of the discontinuity in page 81 about when Marx and Engels both move away from Germany, because in a sense, the ideology that Althusser is pointing out, of course, is the ideology of the left Hegelians, right? Which they have the idea of a unity between German idealism and French politics, right? Which, when they move from Germany, they're confronted with the reality that, well, England is not the organized, capitalist structure they thought, and France has not an organized proletariat as they thought, right? So there, in a Lacanian way, I think this is like the moment of traversing the fantasy, right? What they had in mind, right, of this phantasmatic order is not as they thought, right? And by confronting that, their idea of uniting these two spheres was impossible, right? So they had to think outside of that paradigm. The break is there, right? So yeah, I like that example.
Yeah, that's helpful, Luis. Thank you so much. And I feel like this paradox of Germany's uneven development and its blossoming as an intellectual force is super interesting. Aaliyah makes a nice point in the chat, which is, um, yeah, these eclecticisms. I mean, he's giving us a solution for them. He's giving us a way to manage them, but I'm not sure that Marxism has ever fully figured that out. Kolia, please, welcome.
Hey, Daniel, thank you. Great book, great discussion so far. First of all, I cannot believe I'm not the only Kolia. That's never happened to me in my life. That's unbelievable. A little bit uncanny. And hopefully some of this is helpful. We're talking about Althusser as the only Marxist. I think that's a funny way of approaching the conversation, but it's very useful, and I think it relates to a book that Peter Thomas put out in 2009 called The Gramscian Moment. I think it was released by Haymarket. And in that book, which I, of course, haven't finished, he basically says that Althusser was his prime interlocutor in both For Marx and Reading Capital was actually Gramsci. But he was working with a substandard translation of the prison notebooks. There was a critical version that came out, which was much better in 1975, I think, that he didn't have access to. And so he was, in a way, indirectly debating with a straw man of Gramsci. And what Thomas says is that he defeated Gramsci philosophically. And now today we're left with Althusserian Marxist philosophy. And he sort of relegated Gramsci to politics. And now we're left with Althusser's straw man of Gramsci's politics, which is like stuff like cultural hegemony, some of the post-Marxist discourse we have. And I think this is a little bit unfortunate because I think Gramsci's idea that Marx actually transformed philosophy into politics is a useful way to contrast his ideas with Althusser's. Whereas Althusser has this idea of a discrete, true Marxist philosophy. Gramsci complicates that by saying Marxist philosophy is the philosophy of the conjuncture. And I think Gramsci gets this from Lenin. And one of the dangers, while I am very interested in what we get out of treating Marxism as a true philosophy, one of the dangers of that, I think, is what has been brought up about someone like Catron, who is caught up in thinking about Marxism in this very abstract sense. And it rejects the complicated nature of the conjuncture, right? Which is where politics emerges, where the stakes of Marxism emerge, and where abstract concepts like the proletariat become very problematic, we could say, in each conjuncture. And I think that Gramsci's reading of Lenin is that Lenin elevated the conjuncture above the abstract general principles of Marxism as the prime point of contact between Marxism and the working class movement. However that takes shape in any political conjuncture. And I think Jean-Jacques Lassalle does an excellent job of articulating this. This elevation of the conjuncture as the prime point of contact between Marxism and the masses and politics. So I think that is the Marxist philosophy, maybe a dichotomy that's useful in this conversation. I think that philosophy of the conjuncture is probably what I would counterpose to some of what Althusser is saying. But yeah, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so I don't. Oh, sorry. Do I?
Oh yeah. Oh, go ahead. You go
Yeah,
first,
yeah.
please.
So I have to admit, whenever I read these things about such and such, and I haven't looked at Thomas' book, so all due respect. But whenever I read these things about just in general about such and such didn't have access to this or that, one thing I'm always reminded of is the fact that I think it was only in the Romantic era that the idea of reading an original text assumed like the importance that it has today. So actually, students prior to that, they mostly relied on like sort of summaries, right, that they would use for study. And I guess I'm going to give a salute to the idea of, the ideological field and the problematic, because I think sometimes, it can be sort of a scholastic gesture that, and again, I'm saying this without reference to Thomas' particular proofs, but it can be sort of a scholastic gesture to say, well, such and such, didn't really understand this because they didn't have the real version. I mean, it's amazing when you look across history, right? To think of, all of the medieval philosophers, for example, some of them not writing based on exact texts, to think about what people are capable of doing, right? Based on a general understanding, right? Again, of the ideological field, of the problematic, if you will, right? Even if those ideological fields are precisely ideological. So there's a very significant relationship between Gramsci and Althusser. I don't think it would be controversial to suggest, as Perry Anderson does in his On Western Marxism, that Gramsci's work arose from a greater immediacy with respect to the class struggle in general. I don't feel that I'm capable of getting into this too much, but I do want to say that, I think that both Althusser and Gramsci, share much in common because I feel like both of them are really, really taking seriously, the significance of Marxism as a means of understanding history, right? Rather than what we see more within the German tradition and other traditions, which is a kind of Hegelianized reading of Marxism that often allots like a great importance to the commodity form, and so on and so forth, which is not to say that those authors had no engagement with history, right? But I do feel like if we look within, the German lineage, and I think we see it with, critical theory, Adorno, I think that we see it with value form readings later, right? There is a certain attachment to this conception of Marxism as teleology, right? And we even see that Adorno and Horkheimer will talk about, the failure of world revolution, right? The failure of this teleology to kind of arrive, right? But I think that, with all that said, I think that Althusser does make some significant critiques of Gramsci. And this bigger problem of the conjuncture is going to be a problem in terms of, to what extent, in acknowledging the diversity of the historical processes that have informed Marxism and its political applications in the light of the Russian Revolution, are we going to lose the internal thread of Marxism as a methodology itself? But Althusser does make some valuable critiques. I mean, I think, for example, when he talks about, Gramsci's analysis of, sort of Bonapartism, right? And this kind of perversion, right, of revolution from above and this kind of thing. One thing Althusser will say in Kaffer, right? He says like, part of the problem with this kind of analysis is it presupposes a kind of normative means through which revolution would happen, right? Like that's the only means by which we could deem something else, right, to be sort of distorted by comparison. Right. And it's like, again, we come here to this point where it's like, well, to what extent are we just liquidating Marxism? Right. Isn't there supposed to be this idea of like the proletariat rising up all at once, and waging revolution in this way? But at the same time, I take questions like this by Althusser to be extremely important and provocative to ask with respect to this history. So I'll say.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for the reference to the Gramscian moment. That's a really interesting point. And yeah, Althusser has later lectures on Gramsci, if I'm not mistaken, which I haven't read. And I think that this notion also in Lenin because Lenin was also trying to combat Second International eclecticism. You see this in Imperial Criticism. And so that certainly is, I think, a very interesting point. But I often wonder, in some sense, like Althusser, part of what Althusser's fate has it not been the fact that he, in a weird way, succumbed to like the eclecticism of 68, right? Like that 68 eclecticism got the better of him, perhaps. But JP, what do you think?
Hey, thank you. Great conversation. I'm hearing two things in the discussion so far about I'm worried going to go back to the science and ideology thing. I'm hearing two things here, and I read these two things in the text here up to a point, which is on one side, I think Conrad was right saying that there's a criticism of the complete kind of approach to reading, and there was a valorization of rupture, therefore, and science is defined negatively par rapport to ideology. This is the only one thing that I can gather regarding science from this text, actually. I mean, being earnest here. I don't really understand what science is here. I only understand as a relational negation to the ideological field. That point is clear enough. So there's a valorization of rupture. But doesn't that valorization of rupture comes with also a reverse kind of, the obverse of this is the valorization of the holism of the problematic. Because if we are to believe, as comrades say, that there is a criticism of the complete kind of comparative literature kind of approach, where you are trying to draw concepts from a certain historical past and see the history of the individual concepts, and he's criticizing exactly the continuity of these concepts because they are located within different problematics, which would mean for a good like Carnapian enthusiast like me, a framework. Those concepts are defined by a certain framework. and they only exist and they have their meaning on that inside that framework. Therefore, there's like a holistic kind of element to the problematic, it seems to me. And because the problematics are defined as sets and relational kind of topologies of concepts, science comes in as a kind of a negation of a previous problematic. And then this brings me to another question, which is there an absolute definition of science, or is just the relative definition of science that is at stake here? Because, for instance, I remember it's a text that we are going to read, like on the Materialist Dialectic, he has like the theory of generalities. And in the theory of generalities, he says, theoretical practice works on a material, and the material is either an ideological material or a previously scientific material to make a new science. And the previously scientific material can become ideological. Therefore, it seems to me that you don't have an absolute scientific point of view. You have always an ideological point of view that is a candidate to a scientific point of view, as long as it offers a break, an operation of a certain break within a certain ideological field. So that would mean a relative concept of science and not an absolute concept of science. And so I'm trying to, this always is a way to parse like what I feel is a tension between what is like internal, external things. Here it seems to me that he's saying ideology and philosophy has this in common with ideology. It's worried with internal connections, and history is external to that. Okay, so far so good. But then what is the specific conception of history that you have? Is that a different framework, another problematic? Is a problematic not always a candidate to becoming ideological too? So there's this problem between internal, external, the internal and the external purview of concepts, and with the becoming of ideology and science and the relation and the relative versus absolute concept of science par rapport to ideology. I think these are kind of untidy to me. I've read this book, before, but I'm getting the profiting from the opportunity to discuss with you guys, because this was always untidy to me and a problem in Althusser, even though I'm interested in what he has to say. Sorry if I was if that was too long.
So on just to say quickly, he later relativizes the distinction between ideology and science, right? Acknowledging that science would always contain an ideological component. So I think in some ways, as you may know, or you may not know, you're already anticipating things within his work that he's going to acknowledge. So good work on that. As for the relationship between interiority and exteriority, I would just say that I think that, again, going back to mathematics, as the kind of originary science, if you will, it can be a good example of that. So obviously mathematics has a kind of interiority, right, as a discipline. There's an interior methodology associated with mathematics, but at the same time, mathematics is extremely permissive in the sense it can be applied to just about anything, right? So I think the question is the way that an internal discourse, right, through its own internality, right, can thereby somehow become a medium through which we can understand the world as a whole, right? And of course, I don't think that anyone here is going to claim that, Marxism is as porous as mathematics, right? But I would ask the question of its porosity with respect to the field of the social sciences in that way. And I think we probably have nothing that's more. So I think that's powerful in any case, right?
So we got a lot of points and questions. Thank you, JP, for that. That was extremely rich. Let's go to Daniel Holmes and then to Aaliyah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey. Yeah. So just kind of a few things that were swimming around from stuff people were talking about today. On specifically the relation to social struggles and trying to define the problematic, because something I'm finding really difficult on the point of like humanism and stuff in general, in quite a crude way, is the question keeps going through my head, like, why do any of us give a shit about Marxism and communism and Marxist theory and this kind of stuff, if not in some way related to things like suffering or real life experience or these kinds of things. And with that, I have kept coming back to something he puts in the introduction about Marxist philosophy as the only kind of philosophical project that can account for its own ideological development. And it almost, I think something Conrad said earlier, like it can account for its own problematic, or it can kind of define its own problematic. And with that, it also came up in the chapter in one of the footnotes that he talks about with the problematic. It's not, the quote is, he says, it's not the interior of the problematic which constitutes its essence, but a relation to real problems. Problematic of an ideology cannot be demonstrated without relating and submitting it to the real problems to which its deformed enunciation gives a false answer. And so I kind of, it comes to my head maybe that like, when we talk about what Conrad was talking about with science and method, is something being laid out here almost like not so much a articulation of a historical development of Marxism and the shift of a problematic, but like a part of the method of a Marxist science is this like reflexivity or ability to constitute in its own analysis the problematic that it's working within. And if so, does it mean that when it comes to the question of relating to social struggles, that like for a Marxist philosophy to function, it kind of almost is always thinking in the context of understanding the problematic specific to the social struggle or context that it's operating? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you have a clear enough view of it, but I want to just say something really quick because I think this is really important. Althusser doesn't disregard human suffering. And I know because when you think about anti-humanism, and Ricura makes this point in an essay on him, and it's very important. For Althusser, the band of science is very small and the band of ideology is very wide. And we actually need ideology. Because, and Althusser acknowledges this, like ideology is what makes things go, right? Like you can't do Marxism unless you have some kind of normative compulsion, right? So what in a sense, like, you know, what he's doing here is he's trying to, you know, distill the scientificity of Marx's method, right, as a means of helping guide and arbitrate with respect to political decisions. You know, but he recognizes that, you know, if you look at the whole spectrum of things that we're capable of scientizing, it's not that wide. And obviously, when it comes to these kind of moral dilemmas, like we don't have a science of morality, right? That doesn't exist, right? So we're in the domain of ideology, right? And then concerns like the one that you raised are going to have like a great relevance. And of course, we're never going to reach a point where all of reality is going to be scientificizable in that way. So I think there's maybe one passage in Reading Capital where he sounds a little bit like that. But this is, I think, you know, the clearest understanding of how his work functions.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to sort of, Aaliyah, you can jump in. We do have time, by the way. So don't worry about that.
So I can, but I guess I thought maybe I was being selfish because I'm sort of the question that I'm interested in asking is maybe like less interesting than to like I don't know. I'm not sure. It might be a personal thing. Okay, but so hear me out. Obviously, you know, like the text itself kind of discourages us to like just try to map one concept onto another cleanly from, you know, two different systems or whatever. So like don't want to do that, but also like even beyond that, okay? So we have Althusser talking about like the fusion of the workers' movement with like yeah, um like Marxism, here, like Marxist theory or whatever. Um, and so like, yeah, so I'm really interested in trying to figure out like what the kind of like what is actually like the concrete practical difference because I don't know Althusser as well as a lot of the people here. So this isn't something I can really suss out myself here right now, because we don't have it in front of us. And yeah, I'm wondering like what actually is the difference between, if there is one, between like yeah, like a merger conception and a fusion conception because also the thing is like my initial inclination is like, oh, you know, maybe he would just like change like kind of adjust it semantically a little bit, maybe because of like Kotsky's status as a sort of kind of like boogeyman now and then, you know, when he's writing. But also, then I'm kind of inclined to not think that's true because he like, you know, he gestures to him, you know. He kind of gives him his stars or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe no one can answer to it, but if there's anyone who just like, I don't have the knowledge on Althusser, and I'm just curious about this, because we're talking about practice, we're talking about conjectures, and I'm just like, like, how does this actually shake out to some of the probably very similar understandings of like, um, yeah, like kind of like, yeah, Marxist practice, like in action.
It's a good question. I think at the heart of your question is there a prescription that has some sort of continuity or clarity in Althusser of the relationship between intellectuals and workers? Is this sort of what you're saying? And sort of how is that mediated? How is that thought? And if Althusser ultimately gives us this sort of rarefied, scholastic, sort of detached philosophical Marxism, is that adequate to the struggles that we face? And then you then introduce this distinction that I think the Marxists within DSA, like the true Marxists of DSA, are interested in. Can you describe that? This notion of merger and stuff like that? I'm not sure everybody knows what those terms mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's honestly, it's pretty, I think I can summarize it like pretty basically, which is, essentially like, you want, um Marxists, like, Marxist intellectuals and people who are really like, thinking about theory and, kind of, doing these higher questions, which we've already talked about the legitimacy of that in this conversation, coming into the workers' movement and, engaging as like an equal member of the democratic processes that they are then trying to like further democratize. And then through that, like also bringing them into like a party form where you're, then bringing them into like, like a kind of the higher democratic structuring to where it's eventually kind of like, one unit that's expanded over all of these terrains. And so to me, like a fusion seems like it could be something like that, but he just doesn't give us any information. Like he's just kind of like, oh yeah, you gotta fuse it, and then he just like moves on.
Well,
And it's
yeah, I
like,
mean, I think
I want more than that. Yeah.
it's all about 68, right? Althusser becomes, and we can talk about that at a later time. This is a pre-68 text. So I think there is some important differences of Althusser's theoretical prescriptions, I think, for Marxism after 68. And of course, his um, alienation from the French Communist Party, I think, had everything to do with his, from their perspective, perhaps you could say his eclecticism, even though here he is in these pages denouncing eclecticism. I mean, but there is a lot of self-censorship in Althusser that Conrad and I have mentioned in the past regarding how he balances and negotiates his role as a kind of outcast leader within the French Communist Party. But I mean, at the time,
oh, sorry.
but I mean, at the time, I feel like, these questions, Leah, are sort of answered by a certain Stalinist or Maoist, right? So like you had something like an efficacy of the mass line, like that answers the question. And I think the answer is that Althusser is not so firm in one of those per se. Go ahead, Conrad.
Yeah, and I just want to say that all I want to add, because I think Daniel, that's correct. Like Althusser is not gonna tell you what he's trying to do, because like he can't tell you what he's trying to do, right? Which I think, if we're being honest, what it's really about, is that by pitting himself against like an orthodox conception of dialectical materialism, and by trying to open up Marx's method and make it accessible in a sense, what he's trying to do is to marshal together these diverse social energies that would be capable of breaking out of the impasse that the French Communist Party had found itself in, in the Trente Glorieuses or in the post-war compromise,
Mm-hmm.
right? But very important to remember is that 68, of course, as we know, is not just 68, right? 68 is connected with a whole range of global processes, right? So we have revolutions in Latin America in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, right? We have, all of the Maoist parties, right, that are going to be formed in the latter 1960s, right, and beyond, right, in places like, India and Philippines and Peru and all this, of course, all over, and so on and so forth. So what this is really about, again, that would be the sort of French uh, description of that. But I think what it's really about at a more global level is trying to, because the analogy to the post-war social compromise in France was the détente that had been pursued between the Soviet Union and Europe, right? So it's really about how do you rally together, all of these kind of diverse social agencies in the world and push them to a heightened moment of class struggle, right? And he sees breaking out of these dogmas as really, really important to the achievement of that and creating like an open-endedness with respect to our engagement with Marx's method. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I did get kind of that sense that it was more open, but just since I have a pretty limited knowledge, I didn't know if maybe there was context I was missing. So I really appreciate all that. Thank you so much, guys.
I think it'd be good for Aaliyah or someone. With such a big group, and it's a very talented group. Perhaps people might like present things for us. Like Aaliyah, maybe you could present on some of these things, or Kolia, or like on this notion of the merger formula. Maybe that would be helpful in future sessions. We should think about doing that. Because I definitely want to delegate things out to comrades. And so Justin, jump in, please.
Hello. So there's okay, a couple things I want to say. Um, One thing is I read Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism like a few months ago, and it's interesting because it's really clear to me that a lot of what Althusser is trying to do is what seems like what Lenin's trying to do there in terms of this strong demarcation of materialism and I idealism and kind of this, I guess, firmer notion of science, but also like at the same time, um, it's the way we've been talking about Althusser's science have been really, really different than in my view that book. Um, I know Althusser wrote the essay Lenin and Philosophy. I didn't read it. Maybe someone can bring it up. But my view is MEC is very positivistic view of science, in that, like, Conrad earlier was talking about how science isn't like very rational. It's like a lot of these symbols we put together to construct to make um, organize the world, and that is like exactly what Lenin was like writing against. He's like, we need to use the word image. We cannot even concede to symbols and hieroglyphs and so on. The other thing I was thinking is I feel like a lot of the problem we've been having. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something?
No,
Oh, um, is when we're talking about, like, well, if Althusser is right that we're not stepping out of ideology because we're all subject, we're all like um, we're interpolated as subjects, right? And how does that even lead us to, Marx and science and so on? And I just feel like if we were to do away with what Althusser is doing and try to just go back to the fetishism argument, it just all makes sense. I know Althusser will probably hate it, but if we just go back to fetishism and we say, well, we only engage with the world through these objects with social histories, that we give them reason, right? We give them reason, the magical power, and from that we confuse ourselves as if it's true history, um, and so on and so on. But science is thus like negative. We have to undo fetishism, but we're never like fully out of it. But yeah, I guess that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's so. How much have you been reading Althusser, Justin?
Like the past few days.
Nice, nice. No, it's interesting stuff. I mean, I don't know how you all find it, but like I find him a joy to read, and there's like a Yeah, there's a sense in which like I find myself like chewing in on dense passages, and um they're very, very like thought provoking. So I'm very happy to see that they're so thought provoking for you as well. I do think that there's this Spinozism that I'd love to talk about in future sessions that always seems to me like the kind of incorporation into Marxism of a philosophical orientation that never that's kind of feels forced in some sense. Like the and this idea of ideology, it changes so much, I think, when we get to the ISA, ideological state apparatuses. And a lot of research has actually been done about how Althusser adopts like a Foucauldian understanding of social power, and maybe you could even say like a social ontology after 68, and that is reflected in the theory of ideology, combined with this non-dialectical Spinozism. And so I've always been somewhat, to be very, very crude, on Zizek's side against contemporary Spinozism as an ideology. People get very mad at me for that. Even though he himself has this maxim of no outside to ideology. Yeah, I know Jason Reed has done a lot on Spinoza, but anyways, we it's for
I,
another time.
can
Go
I
ahead,
just
Conrad.
grab something there? So actually, about Lenin and philosophy, this is interesting because like I would have to go over my notes to the text. But when he writes about materialism and imperial criticism, and when he writes about it, it's obvious there's something that's unacceptable to him within it, which is precisely, the immediacy, right, of Lenin's sort of theory of epistemology, as it's posited there. And he subjects it, if I remember properly, to this very strange and like idiosyncratic sort of Spinozist rereading. But I think maybe we could relate this to the text we're describing because he actually does, I don't know if it's a footnote or what, but he actually does mention Spinoza at one point in this text. And the way that he mentions it is he mentions it in contradistinction to the theory of supersession, right? And, we know that we have, of course, Spinoza's three types of knowledge, right? The first type of knowledge, right? We know that the first type of knowledge is that we have, like, you see something, right? So, like, you see the sun in the sky, and you're like, oh, that's the size of a soccer ball, right? And then the second kind of knowledge is like, you know that it's not actually the size of a soccer ball, right? You know that it's an object suspended in space with various chemical properties and so on. And then in the third type of knowledge, typically how it's described, you know this so well that it no longer has to be an arduous basis of reflection, right? So, for example, you can see this with basic mathematics, where, like if I ask you what 2 plus 2 is, you're not going to hesitate to give me an answer or inspect the epistemological premise. But, his point is that there are precisely, because we were talking about rupture, there are ruptures between each of those moments, right? That define the kind of epistemological process. And I think that if I remember properly, in his reading of Lenin, he, he's uncomfortable with this sort of immediacy, but at the same time, he finds these kind of moments within Lenin's text where there's an allusion, to a greater level of epistemological mediation. And he stresses those as a kind of esoteric dimension to what Lenin's saying, at the risk of straining credibility, I think at times. But again, I'd have to go over the text, but that's my thoughts on that.
Mm. Hopefully that's titillating for you, Justin. Thank you so much for being on board. And it's really nice to have new comrades come. Connor, what's up? How are you? Jump in.
I'm good, yeah. Um, I know we're kind of going over time, so I'll try not to be too long, but my question is kind of jumping off of what JP was mentioning earlier. And so yeah, I'm kind of just like circling on Altair is trying to like get rid of teleology and part of what we were reading today. And yet, um, I find that it's sort of like coming in through the back door with this idea of like periodization, right? Because is not periodization in like teleology like just different ways of reading history that are still fulfilling some definite purpose or goal, right? So, um, and yet a lot hinges on this question of periodization, obviously. I mean, the whole drama of this book is, can Althusser substantiate this key epistemological breaks, right? And so, to put it the same thing another way, for Althusser's science to really stand on its feet, the choice of periodization cannot be arbitrary. It has to be demonstrated as operating in history itself. How do you do that? Right? And yeah, I'll just try and read this quickly. This is on page 64. Early works are as inevitable and as impossible as the singular object displayed by Jarry, the skull of the child of Voltaire. They are as inevitable as all beginnings. They are impossible because it is impossible to choose one's beginnings. Talking about Marx, right? And then he goes on to say that Marx cannot, was born in the position he was, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, I shall later return to the necessity and contingency of this beginning later. So this is something he's promising to explain later. And yet I'm wondering if we can sort of suss out how he justifies this sort of thing. And then also, again, on the same page, he goes on to say, the young Marx emerged into the thought world of his own time to think in it in his turn and to enter into the exchange and debate with the thoughts of his time, which was to be his whole life as an ideologue. And this is the big part. At this level of the exchanges and conflicts, there are the very substance of the texts in which his living thoughts have come down to us. It is as if the authors of these thoughts were themselves absent. And what he means by that, at least how I'm reading it, is that we cannot read Marx's choices anyway. Like, it would be wrong to suppose that we could, and we can't do that even if we, I don't know, like recorded him or something. But rather, what we can do is read those choices in the composition of the text itself, which is what we get from his life. And this is then, but then this thing still, for me, comes back to this problem of periodization. This problem of periodization then is going to be determined by which text do we privilege, right? So for me, there's always this decision. We have to make a decision to privilege some text and ignore others. And I don't think that could, again, I don't see how that can be overcome. That seems like a hard rock in Althusser's sort of methodology right now. But I hope this is making sense. I'm wondering if this is maybe
so you're talking. So it makes sense to me. You're talking periodization of understanding the breaks and novelty, or like rupture moments within Marx's thought itself. You're not talking about periodization of like revolutionary history, right?
Well, that's certainly implied in this, right?
It is implied. It is definitely implied.
If you're going to choose to begin your periodization someplace, that would imply that this is beginning after a discontinuity or a certain revolutionary or something.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Otherwise, it would be arbitrary.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, Althusser is close to the theory of Alain Badiou in his notion of periodicity, or even to communist invariance. This idea that, or even it's also translated almost into like a reading method. And I kind of like it too, in a certain way. It's sort of, because what it's capable of doing is sort of taking huge periods of a thinker's time and condensing down through textual analysis, but not necessarily like a literary textual analysis. It's like something different. It's more like, it's more minimalist, where it sort of identifies like Badiou does this with Lacan, and the late Lacan, where he can say like everything is reducible to this notion of the centome or something like that. Like this kind of, you find a nodal point from which everything coheres around. That's a very Althusserian gesture, I feel. And there's some strengths to that as a reading method, right? As a reading method. But then you do have like the Spider-Man meme emerge when it comes to the question of the problematic, because it's like, and even the chauvinism thing too, I'm sorry, but like who's outside of the problematic, who's not? That's almost impossible to determine vis-a-vis science, especially as JP informed us on the relative status of science. So yeah, this has been extremely productive. Conrad, I'll give you the last word and then we'll bounce.
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure if this is going to directly answer your question, but I think that when it comes to periodization, we could refer this back to, the idea that philosophy has no history, right? So, of course, there's an acknowledgement of, a kind of progression in a sense, right? That would be internal to science, right? Or not progression, if you will, but at the very least, transformation, refinement, right? And that when we have the elements, right, of a scientific understanding, that's going to be possible, right? But the thing is that, like, if you look at history, like, if we were to approach it as a kind of holistic totality or without recourse, right, to a sort of scientific method based on things like, social formation, relations of production, and so on, right? That's where you're going to get these kind of ideological schemas that kind of step in and do the work for us, right? And I think that Jameson is very good in this, in a way, in the political unconscious. He talks about the way that, and as a kind of retort to Althusser, he says like, I think that Althusser already goes too far in a certain sense in denying teleology, because the reality is that, teleology would be in a sense, a question of material processes, right? So like within capitalism, right? It's like, capital accumulates, right? You have a greater transformation of social reality and so on, right? So he's kind of rejecting that. But in terms of the question of the text that we choose, I mean, I think what's really important here, right? I don't think that, Althusser acknowledges, I think again, that there's always, particularly later, there's always ideology within science. But I think when it comes to the text that we select, I think that choice is apparent to him. But I think the real question is, are we using Marx's own methodology, right, in order to make those elective choices, right? And I think that that's is going to be very important. And there's no perfect choice, right? Like there's no choice by which we're going to wave a magic wand and reveal the true structure of everything. But the real issue here is methodological grounding, right?
Awesome. All right, so next week, just as a heads up, I think we just have one essay, and it's going to be a big one, an important one. And so, yeah, so 87 to 128 or so. And it's going to be Contradiction and Overdetermination. There's a lot of secondary literature on this essay, so folks can go to town on that. And just like, yeah, I'll carve out some time for Aaliyah and Kolia to maybe present on what we talked about before. And then
Do we feel
otherwise,
like
go
do
ahead.
we feel like it's particularly relevant to the next section? Like maybe would it be better to put it off a week if we have like a
Maybe.
lot? Why
Yeah,
not?
maybe. Well, I mean, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should even do a separate program on it towards the end.
Yeah, maybe like that's just something to flag for
Okay,
I don't
fair
know,
enough. Fair enough.
later.
I like
I
that
mean, I'm
point.
open to whatever, but
No, no, no.
I'm
I
excited
think
about the next section too, though. So I want to make sure we have time for it. That's kind of why I wanted to give up my turn too. I'm like, this is like barely about Althusser. This is like, yeah, I mean, it is, but
all right,
it's
fair
like,
enough.
tangential
Let's
kind
I
of.
talk.
will
Let's reach a consensus in the Discord. All
I
right.
will add that the Pangiotis text is really good for this next section. If you could get your hands on that copy on rethinking.
Share it with us if you
Okay.
can, and then tell us what to read as
Okay.
well. All right, guys. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. We'll talk next week. Peace out.